All right, this is number 24. We're going to find the inverse function. It says given that f of x equals the cosine of x plus 2 plus 1, find the inverse function, f inverse, and state the domain of f and f inverse. All right? So these are kind of interesting because we can use inverse functions, and we do use these inverse functions in calculus, so you want to make sure that you're up on this stuff if you plan to go on. All right, so first of all, let's figure out the domain of this. Well, we know the domain is negative infinity to infinity because the cosine just goes like that, it just keeps going like that. Now we do have a vertical shift, so the range, now the domain usually goes, there's no amplitude change here, so the range of the domain is usually -1. It's usually -1 to +1, right? Okay, but we're adding 1 to this because we have a shift. So you can just add 1 to both these. So if you add 1 here and add 1 there, your actual range is going to be 0 to 2. So that's going to be the range of this function. So this is for f. Now for f inverse of x, it's easy once we figure out for f because we know that the domain and range is switched. So for f inverse of x, the domain is going to be 0 to 2. And the range will be -infinity to infinity. So they just switch. So that, by working with this function, it's a lot easier to find the domain of the inverse function by finding the range of the original function. Bottom line. Okay, so now we took care of that. Now let's actually find the inverse function. So we do our regular four-step process. First step, change f of x to y. So y equals cosine of x plus 2 plus 1. Then remember we interchange the x and the y. So x equals the cosine of y plus 2 plus 1. Then we solve for y. Okay? So we'll subtract 1 from both sides. We have x minus 1 equals the cosine of y plus 2. Okay, now how can we get at the y? Well, this is where we can use the inverse function. And hopefully this is in the right domain, etc. So I'll just say cosine inverse. The inverse cosine of the cosine of y plus 2. All right? And that's going to kind of undo this. And that's going to allow me to get at the y because the y is kind of embedded under this cosine umbrella. So I've got the inverse cosine over here. These undo each other, so I've got y plus 2. And then I can subtract 2 from both sides. And there's your inverse function. So we'll also say f inverse of x equals the inverse cosine, or the angle whose cosine is x minus 1 minus 2. Okay, so it's not too bad. It's, relatively straightforward. As long as you just know how to handle the inverse function. Is that okay? All right. And then we have an equation, number 25. Solve for x. You can see it over here. Solve for x, 6 cosine minus 2 pi, 3 cosine inverse 6 cosine inverse x minus 2 pi equals 3 cosine inverse of x. All right, so we'll just write that out. Oops, x minus 2 pi equals cosine inverse of x. All right? So there's our equation. So we'll try to get all the cosine inverses together. So I'll just subtract that from both sides. So I'll just subtract my 3. Got an equation here, so I'll just subtract here. And on the left, we've got 6 cosine inverse. I'm sorry, what am I doing? 3. Equals 0. And then I'll just add 2 pi to both sides. So I've got 3 cosine inverse of x equals 2 pi. And I'll just divide by 3. And then I want to solve for x, not cosine inverse of x. Oops, sorry about that. Excuse me. There we go. All right, so I just isolated the cosine inverse, or subtracted the 3 from both sides, then added 2 pi. So we've got this, then we divide by 3. So this is what we got. Okay, hope that's all clear. And we want to take care of this, so I'll just take the cosine of both sides. And that just equals the cosine of 2 pi over 3. So these undo each other. So on the left I've got x. And what's the cosine of 2 pi over 3? Well, the cosine of pi over 3 is 1/2, but it's going to be in the second quadrant. So it should be negative 1/2. Is that okay? Oops, dang it. Sorry, excuse me. Okay, so these undo each other. So the cosine of 2 pi over 3, remember the cosine of pi over 3 is 1/2, but it's in the second quadrant. The cosine is negative in the second quadrant, so it's negative 1/2. So there you go. That's 25. So those weren't too bad, actually. They're kind of straightforward. Just have to kind of know what to do, but those are pretty fair questions. So make sure you're up on how to do these types of problems.